The heavy obsidian doors of the sanctum didn't creak. They hummed. A low vibration of precision-engineered granite sliding against marble. Beyond them, the air was thick with the scent of expensive oud and the metallic tang of rain clinging to Sajin's tailored wool coat. He stepped into the expanse of the room, his boots clicking with a hollow rhythm that felt like a countdown. Lynn Ubenefo did not look up. She was framed by a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glowing arteries of the city she now owned. She sat in a chair of matte steel and deep velvet, a throne in everything but name. In her hand, a crystal glass held a finger of amber liquid, the ice clinking softly as she swirled it. The light from the chandelier caught the jagged, silver line of the scar on her collarbone, a mark that peeked out from the neckline of her silk gown like a silent witness. Sajin stopped 10 paces away, his breath hitched. He had spent 5 years imagining this face, but the woman before him was a stranger. The Lynn he knew had been soft edges and easy laughter. This woman was a blade forged in a cold fire. "They told me a ghost from the gutter was asking for an audience," she said. Her voice was a low, melodic silk that cut deeper than a shout. "I told them I didn't believe in ghosts, only in debts." Sajin's jaw tightened, the black dragon tattoo on his neck shifting as he swallowed his pride. He was a man who commanded legions in the underworld, a king of shadows whose name was whispered with terror in the back alleys of Seoul. But here, in the vacuum of her silence, his power felt like paper. "Lynn," he began, his voice raspy. "The syndicate, things have changed. I wouldn't have come if there was any other way." Finally, she turned her head. Her eyes were sharp, dark pools of calculation that stripped him bare. She didn't look at his handsome face or his expensive suit. She looked at him as if he were a bug under a microscope. "You haven't earned the right to use my name," she whispered. She set the glass down on the obsidian side table with a definitive thud that echoed through the hall. "You came here because you are hunted. You came here because I am the only person with enough blood on my hands to hide yours." She leaned forward, the light finally hitting the full curve of her face. A cold, predatory smile touched her lips, one that didn't reach her wary eyes. "Kneel, Sajin." He froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "What?" "You heard me," Lynn said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "The man who left me in the dirt didn't just leave a girl. He left a debt. If you want my protection, I want your pride. Kneel. The queen is busy, and her patience is expensive." The lobby of the Ubenefo Tower was a cathedral of glass and intimidation, designed to make the powerful feel small and the desperate feel invisible. Sajin Kwan stood in the center of the geometric shadows, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor. He was no longer the pristine figure who had walked toward her throne moments ago. The adrenaline of their initial confrontation had faded, leaving behind the raw reality of his situation. A crimson stain was spreading across the side of his white dress shirt, blooming like a dark flower beneath his blazer. He had been grazed by a bullet 3 blocks away, a parting gift from the assassins currently scouring the city for his head. Every breath was a jagged reminder of his mortality, yet the security detail standing like stone gargoyles near the elevators didn't offer a chair, a bandage, or a word. "She is in a meeting," the receptionist had said 6 hours ago. She hadn't looked up from her screen since. The digital clock on the wall pulsed with a rhythmic, mocking hum. Midnight. 1. 2. Sajin leaned his weight against a cold marble pillar, his legs beginning to tremble. He was a man used to being waited on, a man whose time was measured in the lives of others. Now, His time was being bled out in a silent lobby, while the woman he had discarded played the role of the sun, distant, burning, and indifferent to his survival. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the sterile scent of the lobby replaced itself with the smell of rain and cheap copper. He remembered the night he had pushed her out of a moving car to save his own reputation, the way her eyes had reflected the streetlights before she hit the pavement. He had told himself it was for her safety. He had lied to himself for years. "Mr. Kwan?" The receptionist's voice snapped through the silence like a gunshot. Seo-jin straightened his spine, ignoring the white-hot flare of pain in his side. He adjusted his blazer, smoothing the fabric over his wound with trembling fingers. "She will see you now," she said, her tone devoid of empathy. "But only for 5 minutes. Her schedule is full for the rest of the week." He walked toward the elevators, his stride stiff, and his face a mask of his former stoicism. He knew the delay hadn't been about a meeting. There were no executives in the building at 3 a.m. She had made him wait so he could listen to his own blood drip. She had made him wait so he would understand that in this tower, his life didn't belong to the syndicate. It belonged to her. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a reflection of a man who looked like a ghost. Seo-jin stepped inside, the ascent beginning with a gut-wrenching pull. He was going up to the heavens, but he had never felt closer to hell. The office was cast in a low, surgical blue light that made the city skyline outside look like a digital graveyard. Lin sat behind a desk of reclaimed timber, its surface bare except for a single fountain pen and a thin stack of legal documents. She watched Seo-jin approach, her gaze lingering on the way he favored his left side, the subtle hitch in his breathing that betrayed the wet, dark patch on his shirt. She felt a flicker of something, an old, phantom ache in her own scars, but she crushed it beneath the weight of her resolve. "You look pale, Seo-jin," she remarked, her voice as smooth and cold as a lake in winter. "The waiting room didn't agree with you?" He stopped before the desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a chair for support. "The assassins aren't waiting, Lin. My men are being slaughtered. By dawn, the Kwan name will be a footnote if I don't get off the streets." "The Kwan name is already a footnote in this building," she countered, sliding the documents across the desk. The paper hissed against the wood. "I'll give you 48 hours. My private security will move you to a black site, and my surgeons will fix that hole in your side. For 2 days, you will be a ghost that even the devil can't find." Seo-jin reached for the papers, but Lin placed a manicured finger on top of them, pinning them in place. "I haven't told you the price." He let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Whatever it is, I'll pay it. Double, triple. I don't want your money. I want your foundation." Lin's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "These documents transfer the ownership of the Gwangju port and the Seoul logistics hub to my holding company. Permanently. Those are the legal lungs of your family's empire, Seo-jin. Without them, you're just a common thug with a fancy title." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of history. The Gwangju port had been in the Kwan family for 3 generations. It was the crown jewel of their legitimacy. To sign it away was to amputate his own heritage. Seo-jin stared at her, searching for a trace of the girl who used to leave love notes in his pockets. But he found only a sovereign who had learned exactly what he valued most. "You're dismantling me," he whispered, the realization hitting him harder than any bullet. "I'm balancing the books," Lin corrected, her expression neutral. "You took my future once. I'm simply taking yours. You have 48 hours of life, or a lifetime of being a king on a sinking ship. Sign or leave." Seo-jin looked at the pen, then at the blood beginning to drip onto her pristine floor. With a hand that shook from more than just blood loss, He reached for the pen. The ink on the contract was still wet when the world outside the window seemed to dissolve, replaced by the ghost of a night that had never truly ended. 5 years ago, the air hadn't smelled of expensive oud. It had smelled of burnt rubber and cheap gasoline. Rain lashed against the windshield of the black sedan as Seo-jin gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles threatened to pierce his skin. Beside him, a younger, softer Lin was shivering, her hands pressed against a wound in her shoulder that pulsed with a heat she didn't understand. "Seo-jin, please," she had whimpered, her voice small against the roar of the engine. "We have to stop. I can't breathe." Behind them, the headlights of 3 SUVs surged through the dark like the eyes of predators. The syndicate's internal war had spilled over, and Seo-jin was the prize. He had looked at her then, not with the longing he usually wore, but with a terrifying clinical calculation. He wasn't looking at his girlfriend. He was looking at a liability. "They're gaining," he had muttered, his voice devoid of the warmth she'd spent a year memorizing. He didn't slow down. He didn't pull into a hospital. Instead, he steered the car toward a desolate stretch of the industrial district. The logic of his world was simple. If he arrived at the safe house with a civilian witness, he was weak. If he arrived alone, he was a survivor. "I'm sorry, Lin," he'd said, though even then it had sounded like a rehearsal. He hadn't stopped the car. He had slowed just enough for the door to be kicked open. He didn't catch her hand or offer a promise. He had reached across her, his palm flat against her chest, and pushed. The sensation of falling had felt like an eternity. Lin remembered the sickening roll of her body against the wet asphalt, the way the grit tore through her silk blouse and bit into the skin of her collarbone. She lay in the gutter, gasping for air that was thick with exhaust, watching the red glow of his taillights vanish into the storm. He hadn't looked back, not once. As she bled into the oil-slicked puddle, she realized the scar on her body wouldn't be the one that killed her. It was the sudden freezing silence where his heart should have been. The memory flickered and died. Back in the present, Lin watched Seo-jin drop the pen onto the desk. He looked at her collarbone, at the silver line he had etched into her life, and for the first time, his icy eyes shattered. "I remember the rain," he whispered. "I don't," Lin lied, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I only remember the road." The heavy silence of the office was broken by the sharp chime of an intercom. "The contractors are here, ma'am," a voice announced. Lin didn't glance at Seo-jin as she gestured for him to move into the shadows of the recessed lounge. "Stay there. Bleed quietly." 3 men entered. They were titans of the city's shipping industry, men whose fathers had built the very docks Seo-jin just signed away. They came in with the swagger of lions, but as they approached Lin's desk, their shoulders instinctively pulled inward. Seo-jin watched from the gloom, clutching his side, his eyes narrowing as he witnessed a version of Lin he hadn't helped build. "The terms are non-negotiable," one of the men started, his voice booming with a false bravado. "We've handled the Gwangju transit for decades. You can't just—" Lin didn't interrupt him with words. She simply picked up the fountain pen Seo-jin had just dropped and began to tap it rhythmically against the desk. Click, click, click. The man's voice faltered. "I didn't bring you here to discuss history," Lin said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I brought you here to discuss the future. Specifically, the future where I don't leak the audit logs of your shell companies to the maritime authorities. You've been skimming 3% off the top for 15 years. I'm taking 5, and you will thank me for the privilege of staying out of a cage." The man turned gray. That's extortion. That's syndicate tactics. No, Lynn corrected, leaning forward into the light, her eyes reflecting the cold steel of her desk. The syndicate would burn your warehouses. I'm going to own them. There's a difference. Seo-jin felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with his blood loss. He recognized that look. It was the same clinical detachment he had used the night he pushed her from the car. The ability to view human beings as chess pieces to be sacrificed or captured. He had taught her that the world was a predatory place, but he hadn't realized she would become the apex. He felt a twisted, sickening sense of pride. She was magnificent, a master of the dark arts he had spent his life perfecting. But beneath it was a creeping horror. The warmth he had once sought to extinguish in her was gone. In its place was a mirror reflecting his own ruthlessness back at him, polished to a lethal shine. The men signed. They left the room with the slumped posture of the defeated. When the doors clicked shut, Lynn turned her gaze back to the shadows where Seo-jin stood. "You look shocked, Seo-jin," she said, her voice devoid of triumph. "Did you think I spent the last 5 years waiting for an apology? I was busy building a world where I'd never have to ask for one." The stillness of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the city lights. One moment, the skyline was a glittering map of Lynn's conquest. The next, the world plunged into a suffocating, bruised purple darkness. "Down!" Seo-jin roared, his Mafia instincts overriding his agony. He didn't wait for her to move. He lunged across the space, his hand catching Lynn's waist as a high-velocity round punched through the reinforced glass. The window didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed into 1,000 crystalline fractures, blooming like a frozen white rose. They hit the floor together, the air leaving Lynn's lungs in a sharp gasp. "My security," she started, her voice tight with fury. "They're likely dead or jammed," Seo-jin hissed, his face inches from hers. The scent of him, smoke, rain, and the iron tang of his own blood flooded her senses. This wasn't a probe. This was an execution. Another round hissed overhead, buried itself in the velvet of her throne, and then the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed submachine guns began to chew through the obsidian doors. Lynn felt the heat of his body against hers, a familiar weight that sent a treacherous spark through her nerves. It was a memory her body hadn't forgotten, even if her mind had spent years poisoning it. "The service elevator," Lynn commanded, recovering her cold clarity. "It's keyed to my biometric. Follow me." They crawled through the shadows of the luxury suite, the darkness alive with the sound of boots on marble in the hallway. When they reached the hidden panel, Lynn pressed her palm to the cold glass. The door slid open with a hiss, and they tumbled into the narrow, steel-lined lift. As the elevator dropped, the confined space forced them together. Seo-jin leaned heavily against the wall, his breath coming in ragged stutters. Despite herself, Lynn reached out, her fingers brushing the damp fabric of his shirt to steady him. Her hand landed near his heart, and for a heartbeat, the rhythm beneath his ribs matched the frantic pulse in her fingertips. Seo-jin looked down at her, his icy eyes softened by the dim red emergency light. "You're still a hell of a strategist, Lynn," he whispered, his voice vibrating against her palm. The tension in the air changed, shifting from the terror of the hunt to the suffocating gravity of the past. For a fleeting second, the queen and the traitor vanished, leaving only 2 people caught in the wreckage of a storm. The chemistry was a ghost, a phantom limb that still felt pain, pulling them toward a center that no longer existed. Then the elevator chimed, the doors parted to the underground garage, and the cold reality of the hunt returned. Lynn pulled her hand away, as if burned. "Save the flattery for your grave, Sojin," she snapped, stepping out into the garage. "We're not out yet." The safe house was a concrete bunker, hidden beneath an unassuming warehouse, smelling of dust and stagnant air. It was a brutal contrast to the velvet luxury of the tower, stripped of everything but the essentials: a cot, a medical kit, and a single flickering bulb. Lynn pushed Sojin onto the cot, her movements efficient and devoid of tenderness. She ripped open his shirt, the silk ruined and sodden with blood. As she pressed a gauze pad to the jagged wound in his side, Sojin hissed, his head falling back against the cold wall. "Lynn," he choked out, his eyes searching hers in the harsh light. "The night on the road, it wasn't what you think. My father's men, they were in the car behind us. If they had found you with me, they would have used you to break me. I thought if I dropped you there, in the dark, they would follow me instead. I thought I was giving you a chance." Lynn didn't pause. She pulled the medical tape tight, her knuckles brushing his skin with the chill of a winter morning. "Stop," she said. The word wasn't a scream, it was a dead weight. "I spent every night for a year trying to find a way back to you," he continued, the words spilling out like a confession. "But the war, I had to become what they wanted. I had to secure the syndicate just to stay alive. I never intended to leave you in that gutter for good." Lynn finally looked at him, her hands going still. Her expression wasn't one of anger, which he could have fought. It was one of profound, hollow exhaustion. "You think this is about your reasons?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed off the concrete. "You think I've spent 5 years wondering why you did it? I don't care if you did it to save the world or to save your own skin. The why doesn't heal the bone. The why doesn't stitch the skin." She leaned in, her face inches from his, forcing him to see the absence of the girl he once knew. "I don't want your excuses, Sojin. I want you to sit in this silence. I want you to feel the weight of every second I spent screaming your name into the rain while you drove away. I want you to understand that while you were becoming what they wanted, I was dying. And the woman who crawled out of that gutter doesn't need a reason from a ghost." She stood up, tossing the bloodied gauze into a bin. The clatter sounded like a final gavel. "Keep your apology. It's the only thing you have left that I haven't already taken." She walked toward the door, leaving him in the flickering light, the silence of the safe house suddenly feeling as vast and suffocating as the 5 years that lay between them. The blue light of a tablet screen illuminated the sharp angles of Lynn's face as she stood at the far end of the warehouse, away from the cot where Sojin lay in a fevered sleep. Her chief of security, Elias, stood before her, his voice a low vibration that didn't carry to the man in the shadows.
"The dragonhead has made contact," Elias whispered, his eyes flicking toward the sleeping Mafia boss. "They know he's with you. They aren't asking for a fight, ma'am. They're asking for a transaction." Lynn didn't look up from the data scrolling across her screen. "Define the transaction. If we hand Sojin over by dawn, they'll retreat from our borders. They've offered to double the Gwangju port's dividends for the next decade and sign a non-aggression pact that would effectively make your logistics network the only one untouched by the syndicate war. It's a clean sweep. No more assassins, no more safe houses, just total market dominance." Lynn finally looked up, her gaze flat. "They want his head on the platter in exchange for my peace." "They want the ghost buried," Elias corrected. "And frankly, ma'am, he's a liability. Protecting him has already cost us 3 good men at the penthouse. Selling him back to his enemies isn't just business. It's the smartest move you've made all year. You'd be the woman who ended the Quan dynasty and profited from the funeral." Lynn turned her head slightly, looking at the silhouette of the man on the cot. Saw Jin's breathing was shallow, his hand still clutching his side, even in sleep. This was the moment she had engineered her entire life for. The moment where she held the absolute power of life and death over the man who had discarded her. If she handed him over, she wouldn't just be safe, she would be a legend. She would finally be the ruthless sovereign everyone believed her to be. The logic was flawless, the profit was immense. It was exactly what the Mafia version of herself, the one Saw Jin had been so horrified to see, would do without hesitation. The dragonhead is waiting for an answer, Elias pressed, stepping closer. One call, and the cars will be here in 20 minutes. What should I tell them? Lynn felt the weight of the silence she had forced upon Saw Jin earlier. It pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. She looked at her wrist, where a subtle scar hid beneath her watch, a reminder of the night she was the one being discarded for the smartest move. Tell them, Lynn began, her voice a cold, terrifying whisper that made Elias go still, that I don't take orders from people who can't even finish their own kills. And tell them if they call this line again, I'll buy their families before I buy their silence. The warehouse doors didn't just open, they were erased. At the stroke of 4 a.m, the Dragonhead's vanguard arrived in a fleet of black armored SUVs, expecting a transaction. They found a slaughterhouse. Lynn stood on the elevated gantry, a silhouette of velvet and shadow against the harsh industrial floodlights. Below her, the sanctuary had been transformed into a kill zone. She didn't use soldiers in suits, she used the very city she had spent 5 years subverting. As the rival syndicate's men stepped into the light, the heavy automated cranes of the warehouse, controlled by Lynn's encrypted network, swung with the force of falling gods. Saw Jin stood behind her, his hand braced against the railing, watching in a daze of pain and awe. He had expected a gunfight, a messy exchange of lead and ego. Instead, he saw a symphony of cold efficiency. Lynn's security team moved like ghosts, their suppressed rifles coughing rhythmically, systematically dismantling the Dragonhead's elite, while Lynn watched with the detached boredom of a goddess watching ants. You're not saving me, Saw Jin whispered, his voice caught between a realization and a plea. Lynn didn't turn. I told you, Saw Jin. I'm balancing the books. When the Dragonhead's primary lieutenant, the man who had personally hunted Saw Jin, was dragged into the center of the floor, wounded and trembling, Lynn finally descended the metal stairs. Her heels clicked against the concrete, a sharp, terrifying sound that silenced the moans of the dying. She didn't look at the prisoner. She looked at the city outside the open doors. You thought you could negotiate with me, she said to the lieutenant, her voice echoing through the hollow ribs of the building. You thought my territory was a marketplace where you could trade for a man's life. You were wrong. My territory is a closed system. She gestured casually, and the shipping containers surrounding the warehouse hissed open. Dozens of her own men emerged, armed not just with weapons, but with the digital records and titles of the Dragonhead's entire operation. While their soldiers had been fighting here, Lynn's analysts had been seizing their accounts. By dawn, your syndicate won't just be leaderless, Lynn said, her eyes finally snapping to Saw Jin's. It will be bankrupt. I've absorbed your roots, your men, and your legacy. I didn't crush them to protect a king. I crushed them to show the city that there is only one throne. The blood on the floor pooled near her feet, staining the hem of her gown, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Su Jin, standing broken and hollowed out on the gantry above. She had won. She had taken everything from his enemies and everything from him. The war is over, she announced, the coldness in her voice absolute. "Now, we deal with the survivors." The dawn over the city was a bruised cocktail of violet and gold, bleeding over the jagged skyline that Lynn now commanded. She stood on the edge of her penthouse balcony, the wind whipping the silk of her gown against her legs. The air was clean, stripped of the metallic tang of the warehouse, but the silence felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. Behind her, the glass door slid open. Soo-jin stepped out, his movements slow and gingerly. He was dressed in a clean suit provided by her staff, but it hung differently on him now. The arrogance that had once acted as his armor had been stripped away, leaving only a man who looked haunted by the very sunlight hitting his face. He was safe. His enemies were shadows, and his name was cleared. But he was a king without a country, his assets and his legacy now pulsing through the veins of Lin's empire. He walked to the railing, stopping a respectful distance away. For a long time, they simply watched the city wake. "It's beautiful from up here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I never took the time to look at the view when I was the one running it." "That's because you were always looking over your shoulder," Lin replied, her profile etched in the morning light like a marble statue. "When you own the mountain, you don't have to worry about the landslide." Soo-jin turned to her, his icy eyes searching for a crack in her resolve, a flicker of the warmth that had once been his entire world. "You saved my life, Lin. After everything I did. Why?" "Because killing you would have been an emotional reaction," she said, finally turning to meet his gaze. Her eyes were calm, devoid of the jagged hurt that had defined her for years. "And I don't make business decisions based on how I feel. You were the leverage I needed to take the city. You weren't a person, Soo-jin. You were a catalyst." The words hit him with a finality that made him flinch. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the cold metal railing, but he didn't dare close the distance. "The debts are paid," he whispered. "The syndicate is gone. Is there anything left of us? Is there a future where we aren't just ghosts in each other's buildings?" Lin looked down at his hand, then up at the vast, waking metropolis. The scar on her collarbone throbbed once, a faint, rhythmic reminder of a girl who had died in the rain. She felt the power of the throne beneath her feet, the weight of 1,000 lives she now controlled, and the terrifying, beautiful freedom of her own heart. "Years ago, you decided my fate in a car on a rainy night," she said, a small, enigmatic smile touching her lips. "You told me it was the only way. You left it to fate. But look around you, Soo-jin." She stepped back, putting a deliberate, sovereign space between them. "For the first time in my life, the answer isn't up to the syndicate, or the rain, or fate. It's up to me. And today, I choose to have breakfast alone." She turned and walked toward the light of the penthouse, leaving him standing in the cold wind of the morning, safe, alive, and entirely irrelevant.